coach and professor, call me what you want, Lucilius Theriot-Leep. I go by Luke. And I hope you're all doing well. I know the pandemic can be hard, especially even for us, magical folk. The No Match has really let this get out of control, but here we are. And so we have to do what we have to do. It's disappointing that our semester has been delayed, but in the meantime, the headmaster and the faculty have really been working on getting new things to do. In the meantime, it's almost like a self-study program. And my kind of contributions to that have been weekly book recommendations about the history of magic, as I am the Worthwich resident magical historian and Quidditch instructor. So I realized, though, that when I've been uploading these book recommendations, that I've been using some terminology about time periods to kind of key you in or clue you in to when the books might be, or what periods the books might be talking about. But I realized that some of you may not be familiar with the terminology I've been using, especially considering that history changes with time, believe it or not. Historians kind of rewrite it as we go along. And so we've kind of redelineated some of the time periods we've discussed over the course of historical study. So I thought to provide some more context for my book recommendations, and just for good general knowledge, I'd provide a basic timeline of human history. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through all the major time periods of human history, like quite literally from the beginning to the present day. But before we do that, and I'm going to draw the timeline out for you. I know it might be kind of hard, so luckily I've recorded this, and you can kind of go back, and I'll be telling you what I write as I write it. So even if you can't read my handwriting, you can hear it. And you should be able to get a transcript of this recording. I'll work on that too. But anyway, I have a couple caveats to talk about before I begin. So the biggest thing is that this timeline is not going to be to scale. Simply, I couldn't craft a timeline where I couldn't craft like this, whatever this is, 5 or 6 inches was so however many years. I couldn't craft a scale that would be accurate and representative and still allow me room to write, essentially, because the first time period I'm going to include starts from 3 million years ago to 30,000 BCE, and I'll explain what BCE means in a minute. But anyway, 3 million years. I can't condense that and stay on scale when some time periods we're going to talk about later are only about 200 years long. So that's just a note to keep in mind, that this is not going to be an accurate visual representation of time as linear. Now, I have laid out time linearly, and there is a reason for that. This timeline I'm going to present to you is flawed. It is culturally a Western timeline, as opposed to, say, an Eastern timeline. And I know history of magic has been criticized for being too Western, and that is a completely valid critique, and I'm glad it's been made. I've been working to rectify that. But we live in the Western world, and we all share a Western view of time as linear primarily. Other cultures don't necessarily do that, but as we do, that's a timeline I'm going to present. Other cultures around the world don't necessarily view time as linearly, or don't demarcate time the way we do. And I hate to be like perpetuating this, but it's just what we're already most familiar with. And so I'm almost doing it out of a sense of like accessibility. Like, I don't want to give you something that you wouldn't understand, like, or you wouldn't have any kind of grounding in. So I'm trying to give you something that you're already kind of familiar with, and then I'll just kind of expand upon it. We can talk about different timelines and things like that in person, or over chat or something when we've got more time to flesh it out. But for the purposes of this video, this will be a Western timeline of human history. It will be linear, but it will not be to scale. So let's start. Oh, actually, I am going to, after I complete the timeline, I'm going to place all the magic that we discuss in the History of Magic Mastery track on the timeline, so that you can see just how much of human history we're going to cover and what amounts to essentially about 10 hours of coursework. It's pretty cool. We don't cover all of human history, obviously, but we do cover stuff that falls into just about every major world period. So yeah, let's do it. So like I said, we start human history about 3 million years ago. 3 million years ago. So we extend that all the way into about, ooh, that's a little crooked. I have to move, I apologize. About 3,000 or 2,600 BCE. Now, BCE stands for, you can't see my face. BCE stands for before the Common Era. When we hit the Common Era, we will start saying CE. We are currently in the Common Era. BCE and CE have simply replaced BC and AD, which you may be more familiar with. BC and AD were Latin terminologies derived from a specifically Christian timeline. And scholars have kind of said, well, we shouldn't be foisting Christianity onto all of human history and all of human experience. So they kind of restructured that and changed it to kind of fit the timeline the same, essentially. There is no difference between BCE and BC before Christ, or CE, the Common Era, and AD. But it is, I think, more inclusive to use BC and CE instead of BC and AD. Or excuse me, BCE and CE and BC and AD. It's very confusing. But anyway, I'm using BCE and CE because it's more inclusive. It's not more explicitly Christian. Nevertheless, the demarcations are still based on the birth of Christ. Year 0 in both scales is the birth of Christ. So it's kind of fake inclusivity, but it's what we have right now, and it's the accepted trend at the time. So we're just going to have to run with it until something better comes along. Now, back to our timeline. 3 million years ago to 2600 BCE is what we call prehistory. Prehistory is essentially all human history before the onset of writing. So this is prehistory. 2600 BCE is how far back we date our earliest and oldest forms of writing in textual format. So that's why we stop prehistory there and we begin the next period at that. That is our earliest form of writing, is 2600 BCE. If you like a better round number, you can use 3000. I've included it there. I personally prefer the 2600 BCE because it gives us a defining reason for why this period ends. That brings me to another point of the end and start dates for these time periods. Now, they are all completely arbitrary, and they have all been superimposed on the past by modern and contemporary scholars. So there was not a sense in human life at 2600 BCE when it became 2599 BCE. Everyone was like, whoa, prehistory's over. That did not happen. All of these linear demarcated end and start dates are arbitrary. And the transition from one period into the next is completely gradual. It's not a switch. It's not like lights on, lights off kind of thing. It is a gradual change over time. But we have delineated history into time periods for our own benefit, just so that we can talk about general areas of time more specifically than others. If I say in the past, that's a little vague. That could mean yesterday. It could mean 300 million years ago. But if I say prehistory, well, you know I don't mean yesterday. So that's kind of a note to keep in mind with all of these end and start dates. And I will explain what a lot of them are, because some of them are significant dates and have been selected as such. But anyway, back to prehistory. Within prehistory, we do have three other time periods. We have a period from 30,000 BCE to, oh, I'm moving the table, to 10,000 BCE. And that is what we call the Paleolithic era, or the Paleolithic period. When you hear the paleo diet, it is based off of this time period. It's supposed to be somewhat, in theory, representative of what people in the Paleolithic period ate. That's not completely inaccurate. The Paleolithic diet in no way resembles what humans actually ate in the Paleolithic period, but it's fun that the Paleolithic, mentality, I guess, is resurging in our popular culture. So that's one period. The next period, from 10,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE, is the Mesolithic period. Mesolithic. Sorry, my handwriting is kind of messy, y'all. I don't write on whiteboards very often. So we've got within prehistory, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and then our last period within prehistory is going to be the Neolithic period. Neolithic. So that's prehistory. Humans were around, there's my head, in our modern form during these time periods. That's why we're starting here. The history of the universe and time does expand back beyond 3 million years ago, but this is a timeline of human history. So that's why we are starting 3 million years ago. Now, the next time period we're going to cover is my personal favorite. For me, typically, the dustier, the better. But we are going to talk about ancient history. Ancient history, indeed, follows prehistory and extends from the development of writing in 2600 BCE and ends around 476 CE or 500 CE, depending upon your view. So there's ancient history. And it ends around 476 or 500 CE, which means that, let's see, where would it be? Year 0 would be right around there. Okay, so this is the birth of Christ, year 0. The birth of Christ, give or take, there's debate. This is where before the common era, and this is the common era. So you see, obviously, this period covers up to 3 million years. And it is shorter than this entire timeline, which only covers about, well, I mean, it covers exactly 2020 years. So obviously, this timeline is not to scale. But nevertheless, within ancient history, there is another time period we call classical antiquity. Classical antiquity spans from about 700 BCE. Let's see. It's going to be around there, give or take. So 700 BCE. So it's going to be classical antiquity within the ancient period. Now, we need to talk about what's happening in the world at these times. If we're thinking about classical antiquity, we're talking Greece, Rome, and Egypt. Now, Egypt actually extends a little bit farther back, and Greece really does expand back to around this area, depending upon how you define Greek, which we won't get into that. But so around here, give or take, we're talking Mesopotamia. We're talking Sumerian culture, the rise of civilization in the Middle East. We're talking the development of civilization in Egypt, in Africa, in northern Africa at this time period. Then Greece kind of arrives on the scene as a prominent civilization, Rome shortly following after, both interplaying with Egypt. I talk a lot about this in my first year class, so I won't go on much more. But that's kind of the eras that we're thinking about in this time. Now, 476 CE is the fall of the Western Roman Empire at Rome. That is why we have demarcated the end of ancient history there. Some people say 500 for a round number. If you prefer 500, by all means, go for it. But it is based, the end of the ancient history period is based on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Of course, by this point, Rome also had an Eastern Empire, which falls much later, and we will talk about that when we get there. But that's the ancient period, that's ancient history. We're going to talk about now my second favorite time period, the Middle Ages. So, the Middle Ages start when, quote unquote, when the ancient period ends. It's not like a wholesale, like, all right, we're in the Middle Ages now, by any means. But for the purposes of timelines, the Middle Ages start when the Roman Empire falls. Okay? And it goes for about 1,000 years, all the way over here, I'd say, is about, for the purposes of my scale, 1,000 years to about 1,500, or if you'd like to be more precise, 1453 CE. So what is significant about 1453 CE? 1453 CE is the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. So that is the end of the Middle Ages, also called the medieval period. So we've got the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. Sorry, my handwriting's awful, but it says Middle Ages / medieval period. Now, of course, with these other time periods, there is also a breakdown of the Middle Ages. The breakdown of the Middle Ages goes about like so. We've got about halfway through, we've got a year of 1000. The first 500 years of the Middle Ages is what we call the early Middle Ages, formerly called the Dark Ages. So when you hear people talk about the Dark Ages, they really mean these 500 years before 1000 in the Middle Ages. Now, scholars have since kind of rejected using the Dark Ages because it implies that people during the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages didn't know anything, and that's completely false. It was originally called the Dark Ages because we didn't have enough texts and information and material sources to really understand what people knew, but that is quickly changing as historians are learning to analyze different kinds of sources and not just writing alone. So they kind of, as they learn more about the time period, they say, well, it really wasn't so dark. We were more in the dark than them, looking back in the past. So we've since said just the early Middle Ages will suffice. Year 1000 is a completely arbitrary deadline chosen specifically for its roundness. But oddly enough, around year 1000, there was an economic upturn in Europe that really influenced the next period called the High Middle Ages. And it goes till about 1250 CE. So when you think about the Middle Ages, typically you are going to think about the High Middle Ages. It is like the peak of the medieval period. I'm going to abbreviate Middle Ages MA since I don't have lots of room. But anyway, when you think about the Middle Ages, mostly what you're thinking about is the High Middle Ages, the peak of the medieval period. That, as to be expected, is followed by the Late Middle Ages. Again, I'm abbreviating Middle Ages MA, which end with the fall of Rome in the east at Constantinople in 1453 BCE, or if you prefer a round number, around 1500. Now, what follows is an interesting development. It's called the early modern period. It's something new to me. I actually did not discover it until this year. Not like discover it, like it existed. I wasn't the one who did it. But I was not familiar with this period until I've begun more of my research. So the early modern period starts around 1450 when Rome falls in the east and goes until the Age of Revolutions in approximately the middle of the 1700s. So I'm just going to say about 1750 CE. So when all the revolutions start happening around the world, largely when you think about French and American revolutions, that's about when the early modern period ends. So we've got, oh, why is it not marking? There we go. We've got the early, oops, it's getting worse, early modern period. Now, this has actually been, as it's new to me, a fascinating research interest of mine. I've been doing a lot of research about magical history in this time period. Specifically right now, I'm looking at class distinctions in magic. What were the differences and similarities between magic practice in the Middle Ages and the early modern period? Was it the same? Was it different? And I'm discovering it's very complicated. It wasn't always the same. It wasn't always different. If you're interested in that, talk to me. I have tons of resources, and I'd love to just talk about it. But this time period is particular in that most scholars who study the early modern period are also kind of closet medievalists. You can't understand the early modern period without understanding the Middle Ages. And I would argue that this boundary, of all the boundaries on this timeline, is probably the most blurred. There is the most gradients here between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period than I would argue in any other time period on this board. So keep that in mind. We didn't just emerge into the modern period as we think of it today with like industrialization and things like that. But speaking of industrialization, this timeline does not include major scientific time periods movements or major artistic time periods movements. So you won't see the Enlightenment, you won't see the Industrial Revolution, you won't see the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, which all kind of fall right up in here. You won't find things like the Renaissance. The Renaissance was an artistic movement, though between you and me, basically just the early modern period. Or really this part, the Renaissance is kind of right here, kind of spanning the boundary into the early modern period. But anyway, so yeah, when you hear people talk about those eras, those are not necessarily time periods. Those are intellectual movements, either in science, religion, philosophy, or art. So we won't see any of those. Now, again, Age of Revolutions at 1750. We're going to go back all the way over here, and we're going to continue. From the Age of Revolutions on, we have, if that was the early modern period, you might expect this is the late modern period. And it goes until another arbitrary date, 1914. So let's see, we're just going to stick, this is obviously not going to be a scale, we're going to stick 1914 right about here because that's about the last thing I can reach. 1914 CE. Of course, 1914 is demarcated as the end of the late modern period because World War I happened. in 1914. But anyway, this period, down on the ground, is the late modern period. Late modern, ooh, that's messy, period. So, I don't have much to say about the late modern period. Frankly, it's my least favorite period on this board. Again, I didn't realize it existed until just recently. I always assumed it was just, this was all just the modern period, which for a long time it was. In scholars' eyes, the modern period started after the Middle Ages, around 1453 with the fall of Constantinople and the invention of the printing press right around that time as well. But then they started realizing that there were big differences between life in the early 1500s and life in 1914. That's kind of a big change. This is when things like the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment happened that revolutionized the way people lived around the world. So they began splitting the modern period into the early and the late modern period. Now, what happens in 1914, World War I, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and all that, is actually not why this date has been chosen. I mean, it's been chosen because it's World War I, but we now refer to the time period following 1914 as the contemporary time period or contemporary history. And what that means is that is history within living memory. So contemporary. So this is history that people who are still alive might have experienced. Now, of course, that boundary is quickly changing as people who lived in 1914 are most likely dead by now. You know, someone who was born in 1914 would be 106 today. And there are definitely people alive who are older than 106, but nonetheless, they are few and far between. And unfortunately, their numbers will only decrease from this point. So I'd imagine within the next few years or next few decades, scholars are going to be rethinking contemporary history because it will no longer encompass remembered lived experience. I would argue now, anybody who was born in 1914 does not remember 1914, and indeed not the probably first 5 years of their life, maybe. So this boundary is arbitrary, and I think it's going to be changing soon. We'll probably get something probably around 2000, I would imagine. There's going to be another historical boundary marked right around 2000 that we're going to say, or maybe it'll be 2001 because of 9/11. Historians like to pick dates of big events. So that's my hot take. But anyway, what happens now is we reach the present day, which is where we are now. And of course, the future extends, beyond this timeline. Now, that's kind of everything that has happened in human history in terms of time periods in the Western, I don't want to say not canon, but or belief system, but in Western culture. So yeah, it's a lot, and I know that might be hard for you to see, but if you have questions about it, let me know. Now, what I want to do now is situate the magic that we talk about in History of Magic on this timeline. So, in History of Magic Year 1, we cover classical civilizations, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And we are covering what is largely all of ancient history. So we cover ancient history and, why is it not marking? In my first year class, we talk about the founding of Rome, which happened around 700 BCE, which is why that date was chosen. It's not exact because we don't know exactly when the Rome was founded, but it was around 700 BCE, give or take probably 50 years. We talk about Egyptian wisdom potions, happen right around in here. And we talk about Greco-Egyptian religious syncretism. which is the merging of Greek and Egyptian culture and magic. That's happening all right in here, from 332 BCE for the next 100 years or so. Then we talk about Roman curse tablets. Those happen kind of all throughout the existence of Rome. We find curse tablets, and we even find them in Greece too. So year one, we cover ancient history. Cover pretty good. We don't talk about magic in this time period just because we don't have lots of knowledge and material for magic. We don't know a lot about it in that time period. And indeed, we do know some about Sumerian and Mesopotamian magic, but not as much as we do just a little bit later with Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Now, let's see, what is year two? Year two is Malaysian magic. And by the way, this is all subject to change in terms of the mastery trick. But this is kind of what I have routed out now. Year two is going to be Malaysian magic. And it kind of takes a jump past the Middle Ages into the early modern period and the late modern period. Now, Malaysian magic is interesting in the time period we are discovering it because it is so diverse. Malaysian magic is kind of a snapshot of Asian magic because so many Asian cultures are present in the country of Malaysia in this time period. I'll explain more of that if you take History of Magic year two. But we basically cover magic and talk about things from the beginning of the early modern period into the late modern period in Asia. We talk about largely defensive magic that year and a little bit of magical creatures. So we talk about invulnerability magic as a specific kind of defensive magic. And we talk about seances. And seances, I know, spooky. But I'm not talking about like summoning the dead. That's not what this is. It is more of a process of speaking to magical creatures. And we talk about Malaysian shamanism versus just magic. And we talk about a little bit of like warfare because we're talking about defensive magic. And especially during these two time periods, the early modern and late modern period, we see lots of warfare. This is almost, I don't want to say the age of empires because you have empires back in ancient history as well, and indeed in the Middle Ages. But this is when the British Empire is at its peak. This is when the Portuguese are creating their empire, and the Dutch are creating their empire, and the Americans create their empire. So that's kind of what's happening there. Year three in History of Magic and the Mastery track is kind of a jump back to the Middle Ages. We talk about Celtic, Norse, Scandinavian magic in the Middle Ages, the whole Middle Ages, because these practices kind of stemmed the entire period. So we covered this time period in year three. So that's year one, year two. Let's see, year two, that's a horrible two. And then, let's see, year three. We talk about divination. In year three, we talk about runes, casting runes a little bit. I don't teach anything Professor Theriot teaches. I don't want to like step on anybody's toes, and I don't want you to repeat anything. We do talk about runes and rune casting. We talk about divination. We talk about charms. We talk about folklore. We talk about druids. We talk about Merlin. Who doesn't love Merlin, right? Greatest wizard of all time. I wouldn't say that is my belief. That is the belief that is out there, though. And then what we do is we actually contrast Celtic, Norse, Scandinavian magic in the Middle Ages with African magic in the Americas during specifically the end of the early modern period and the late modern period. So right at the boundary of the early modern period. Ooh, I'm going to put year three as well. We talk about magic that was taken with slaves from Africa to the Americas, so to South America and to North America. I don't want to get into the details of that because it's super complex and it's very fascinating. But basically, in much the same way that Greece and Egypt merged cultural and magical practices, that was the case as well with slaves and the native peoples in South America and North America that they encountered. Native peoples in North America, I guess, does mean Americans at this time, especially in the late modern period. That's the cultural syncretism that I'm talking about, the emergence of a new culture that was developed from slaves and American colonists or citizens, depending upon the year, basically, their cultural interactions. So that's what we talk about in year 3. And what we do is we contrast and compare the practices from a very white, Western, Anglo practice in the Middle Ages with a very non-Western magic from a culture of color. It's actually going to be super fascinating. One of my favorite years, even though this period is not really my area of expertise. Now, year 4, we flirt back and we talk about the boundary between early modern periods and the Middle Ages. So I'm going to put 4 right around here. And what we do in year 4 is we pivot. In years 1 through 3, we are recreating magical practices. And we're redoing magic that was done in the past with, of course, modern, caveats and whatnot. In year 4, we don't do that. In year 4, we talk about magical trends and research skills, because part of being a magical historian, if that is something you're interested in, is doing research. And I don't want you to think like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to write a 20-page paper or anything like that. That's not what this is. It's just meaning looking for magic in places you don't expect it. So what we do in year 4 is we look at the plays of William Shakespeare and we look at the magic and the magical creatures he describes. We'll probably talk about, if I had to say right now, we'd probably look at The Tempest. Prospero is a wizard. Caliban is arguably a magical creature. We would look at Richard III and Margaret's curses. We'd look at Macbeth and the witches and their divination and predictions and prophecies. And ghosts abundant in Shakespeare, right? So we'll talk about probably curses, magical creatures, things like that in Shakespeare. And what we'll do is we'll analyze that material for magical relevance. And we'll practice on Shakespeare. And I'll talk about general Elizabethan trends of magic, just so that we can kind of situate the work we're reading in a historical context and a cultural context. But then what you'll do is I will teach you how to find sources, or I can recommend, interests or sources that might interest you based on your own interests. And then you're going to kind of go off on your own and do that same kind of analysis on your own work. So maybe you're fascinated in presentations of necromancy, and so you want to look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Or maybe you think science is magic, and you want to argue that Einstein is a wizard and his quantum mechanics were informed by magic. I personally am of that belief. I have researched Einstein kind of extensively before. I'm personally not a fan of Einstein, but can't deny what he did for science, and I think it had something to do with magic. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff we'll be doing in year 4. Year 5 is an interesting year. It covers this boundary. Well, really a little before that. Year 5 falls right in here, really the early modern period. And we talk about witch hunts. We talk about the politics behind magic. We're not recreating magic anymore. What we're talking about is how magic is viewed by people who don't understand it, or by people who do understand it and politicize it. We talk about the rise of witch hunts in Europe, and we specifically talk about the Salem witch trials in North America. And what we do is, after I've kind of introduced you to that area of study, we then will recreate a witch trial, a mock witch trial, so that you can demonstrate your understanding of the political workings, the cultural workings of magic within a culture and within a community. So, it should be pretty fun. So that's human history, all of human history, and I don't know how many minutes. I haven't timed this. I've kind of rambled. I'm sure it's been long and boring, but here we are. History is not for everyone, folks. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope this is kind of help contextualize some of the events you might, be familiar with, but maybe not the time periods in which they happen. And I hope that this has kind of shown you that even in 10 hours of coursework in history of magic in our mastery track, we cover basically all of human history except the contemporary period and prehistory. And the reason I don't cover contemporary history is because you're living it. So, I mean, magical practices from, like, say, the 1920s might be a little different, but I mean, they're still almost the same as today, I'd argue. And then we don't cover prehistory because we don't really know much about magic in prehistory. So, yeah, I mean, the breadth of knowledge that you're getting at Worthwich is kind of remarkable. So don't discredit it. And I know we're all disappointed that we're not going to be seeing each other in a month. Or really, it would have been less than a month for the semester. But we will see you all soon next year at the very latest. Maybe sooner if the pandemic, the muggles figure it out and, like, get it under control. They don't want to listen to the magical community and the experts, but we won't get into that. So yeah, that's all I've got. If you have questions about anything I have said, or you find that anything I have said is wrong or confusing or perplexing, let me know. Message me. I'm happy to talk about it. I am capable of making mistakes. We all are. But this is kind of my understanding of the timeline of human history. I hope you found it useful. I hope that even if you don't pursue the magical history or mastery track, or you don't have any interest in it at all, that's totally cool. That this is still relevant information for you, because we're all living in a world that was informed by each and every one of these time periods. So yeah, that's all I got. Have a good day. I hope to see you all so soon at some of our socials. I'll be coordinating another Quidditch virtual practice soon too. So look out for that. I'll leave just kind of the board there for just a moment in case you want to get a screenshot or one last look at it for any notes or something you might be taking. Okay, that's it. Bye, everyone.